Why are the potentials of millions of English language learners going unfulfilled in the United States? I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. If you're interested in global education, education policy, please like and subscribe. So my last video, I talked about how being multilingual or knowing more than one language is really a strength, and that almost like a superpower. It helps students cognitively and communicatively. And I gave a statistic there that if students who enter school at a very young age in the United States, generally about kindergarten, if they're able to exit within about 5 years, in other words, if they could go to middle school and no longer need English learner services, they actually outperform their peers. And if you're a teacher or you talk to any teacher, you're likely to hear something like, I had this amazing student who spoke many languages, and that student was just incredible. That student was so gifted. That student became a valedictorian, or that student did something just amazing once that student got to high school. I have a student who did very, very well. She was not in English learner services for very long, and she's actually won awards now for the Future Farmers of America. She's won national awards, and she's won awards for volunteering because she's really, really active in the community. She helps so many people. So you hear stories like that about these children who've just done super well. But then on the other hand, you hear about these kids who just lag behind, and we call those long-term ELLs or LT-ELLs. And we don't have really good numbers about how many students exit at what point. However, we know that there are 3 times as more students in elementary school that are learning English as in high school. But that really doesn't give us a good number to work with, because many students come in school, they immigrate and they come in middle or high school, or there's states, especially in some states, there's been a huge increase, so that number may just be more children coming in at kindergarten level. So it's really, you can't really tell. But based on those statistics, you can kind of generalize that there are many, many students who do well and get out of English learner programs. But the ones who end up staying, these LT-ELLs, long-term ELLs, face really, really big challenges. So if you look at the NAEP data, the National Assessment of Educational Progress data, which is taken every year, there's generally between a 25 and a 40 point score difference between ELLs and their peers, and the test is taken at grades 4 and grade 8, and it's pretty much about the same. It varies a little based on the grade and the subject, if it's math or reading, but there's a huge achievement gap, and that achievement gap is more or less identical to students who have disabilities. So many students are in American schools and are really struggling as English learners, even if they've been in the classrooms for a long time. So why is that? What makes the difference between these superstars and these students who struggle? So there's several factors. On an individual basis, students who know the first language really well tend to do much better with English, and that's based on a theory called threshold hypothesis. So if students know their first language really well, and especially if they have some written knowledge of their first language, that first language helps them to learn the second. And so a lot of these students who do really well are students from relatively educated backgrounds, and maybe their parents read to them. They had a lot of community support. They spoke their language in the community often. Maybe they lived with family members who only spoke the first language, so they learned it that way. But there are students who have a really, really strong foundation in their first language, and then there are students who don't. And as a teacher in rural schools, I taught in Northeast Tennessee in rural schools where sometimes the student was the only language learner. I saw this a lot. It's called semilingualism. So with basic communication, the child would do fine. In fact, the teacher would be telling me all the time, I don't understand why your student needs your services. They speak fine. The student speaks fine. I understand everything I'm saying. But when it comes to academic language, that student will struggle because there's not that foundation. That student doesn't have any kind of knowledge, world knowledge, based on the first language. So then when it comes to learning things like science and advanced vocabulary and reading skills especially, that student struggles. So the best thing for students who are learning English is some form of bilingual education. Now, there's a lot of controversy in this country over what that means, because in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a lot of political issues surrounding this topic. There was the idea that if you had a student in bilingual education, that student never learned English. And that is not what bilingual education is. Bilingual education is where you use both the first language and the second language. And there's different models sometimes, particularly in some of the border states that have really large populations of students who may speak Spanish or another language. Out in California, some of the Asian languages, New York, places like that. They may have a transition. So you may start teaching in the first language, help the child to learn how to read and learn basic concepts, and then gradually introduce English. And so then by the time the child has been in the program, 2, 3, 4 years, that child is totally bilingual. The best program is called 2A immersion, and in that kind of program, about half the class are native English speakers that are learning the target language, and then half the class speak the other language. So states like Utah have done this. Ohio has many bilingual education programs, 2A bilingual educations. Georgia has some programs. And these are really good because the students interact in both languages, and they really learn from each other. And the students generally come out fully bilingual, knowing a lot about the world and having experiences culturally where they can communicate with each other. And those students do really well. The test scores for those students are generally really good. The problem with that is that over half of students learning English are in schools where there's very low levels of students learning English. So I would go to school sometimes and there might be one student in the whole school who needed English language services. So that makes that hard. So that's where the community, the family, even the teacher, if the teacher can bring in the child's language and culture in some way, that's where that is helpful. There are also some, what you might call policy issues that affect students learning English. So, there is a law from the late 1970s. It's based on a court case that says that students who need English language services must receive supplemental instruction. However, that was never put into legislation. It's not like IDEA for students with disabilities, where there's a law that was passed by a legislature and it's very specific. It's just a court case with a very vague ruling. So because of that, a lot of times students are overlooked, and there's often very little funding for these students, and it's kind of a free-for-all. People just do, as the Bible says, they do what they think is right in their eyes in many places. Some places are very well organized with English language services. Those are the places where they have a lot of English learners, particularly the Northeast. They sometimes have some really good programs that include bilingual education or include really rigorous programs that help students to learn English at a deep level. But many times, particularly in the South, particularly in rural and underserved schools, there's just a real lack of training among the staff and a real lack of funding. So, and it depends on the state. Like when I worked in Tennessee, there was the legislature there, believe it or not, because Tennessee is not the most progressive state, but the legislature there and the State Board of Education had required service hours for students. And depending on the student's scores, how the student did the English proficiency test the year before, or how the student placed, the student would need so many hours a day. And they also lowered the student-teacher ratio quite a bit. Here in South Carolina, there's no required service hours. So they have, because again, they have to. There's this, teachers are funded. There are English language learner teachers, but that child can be seen very, very rarely at times. And especially if that child is like in a rural school or in a school where there's not much diversity, that student may not get much at all. That student may just get virtual learning, which is not ideal for language learning, or that student may see a teacher very seldom. So that's not good. Funding for English learner programs is pretty much static, and it most recently was at $100, a little over $100 a child nationally. So that's called Title III. So every district or every state, and sometimes there's a consortium, just several districts if there's very few students, but those entities would get about $100 a student to help that student. And of course, that's very little. That's not even enough to buy supplies for that student in most cases. And the students also have rights, and there's a way that you can help these students. Regular classroom teachers can help students through the use of what we call scaffolded materials. That means materials that are easier for the child to read, to understand, things that include things like tech support, like illustrations. I have a book that's designed for English learners, and it has illustrations, it has a glossary, it has games to help the student learn, just things like this. Most teachers have very little training in this. The teacher schools have not made this a priority. In recent years, there's starting to be some emphasis on teaching English learners, but it's still very antiquated. And a lot of it's not based on good practice. It may be somebody who doesn't even really have a background in that who's teaching the class, because there's not, especially in these rural communities, there's not a lot of people who know about this. And so teachers have no idea what to do. And many times even good meaning teachers will do things like they'll ignore the child. They may not know what to do, and they may just put the child in a corner and let the child color or, sleep, because they just don't understand. They may think the child has a learning disability and inappropriately test and place that child in special education. There should be, at this point, testing methods in the home language, but those are always reliable because the child may have interrupted schooling. In other words, the child may not have a good education in the first language. And if a child's put into special education and it is not appropriate for that child, especially if that child's an English learner, it's not a good thing, because that child has limited opportunities to learn, and there are lowered expectations for that child, and it, in most cases, is very harmful if that child does not need special education. So there's also a high failure rate for students learning English, and students learning English, especially when the child is young, out of compassion, teachers will say, oh, well, that child's really small. I hear that a lot. I heard that a lot as a teacher, particularly Latino kids or Asian kids. That child's really small, and they need an extra year to grow up and to learn more English, so we're just going to retain that child. And I've even had adopted parents insist on that before. The problem with that is it greatly increases the dropout rate for these students. Many times students, English learners, especially English learners who struggle, their families are in poverty, and there are a lot of needs in the house. It's not always the case, but many times these students who struggle, something happens by that time that child gets to the age where that child can drop out, and that child never graduates. That child drops out because there's the need to work, or there's the need to take care of a family member, or the student is just tired of school. The student he's been at school for years and it's not a good place for him. He may be in all these remedial classes and feel like there's no hope. The student drops out, and if the student stays in that class, stays in the grade that's appropriate, that student's much more likely to graduate. Even a year makes a huge difference. The dropout rate for English learners is really high. It's not a good thing. And sometimes the flip side happens. So we got these teachers who are not trained to work with these students. Unfortunately, there is racism in schools today. It's unfortunate, but there is. And the teachers have so much going on. They don't know what to do with these students. They may have students with disabilities who do have a lot of laws behind them. They're fortunate. Students with disabilities are fortunate to have really good advocacy, even though they still don't get what they need, unfortunately. And I'm going to talk about that in a future video. But there are lots of laws about dealing with students with disabilities, and so those students might be prioritized, helping those students, or helping students who may have a higher socioeconomic background, unfortunately. And schools, parents who rock the boat, so to speak, and really push for their child to have a good education. And in most foreign cultures, parents are not supposed to question the teachers. It's supposed to be kind of giving the teachers the responsibility to choose what's right for the child. But for American teachers, that's pretty foreign. So I hear a lot of things like, well, that parent doesn't care. Well, yes, that parent does care. That parent cares enough that they're willing to put your child in your hands. Parents sometimes can't communicate with the school, and the schools are supposed to provide interpretation, but again, Sometimes it's hard to come by, and with such limited funding, it's hard. So sometimes these students are just pretty much past them, and they're supposed to have accommodations. In other words, things that make it easier for them to access the material. Things like sometimes having tests read aloud, having extra time. That's a biggie, extra time. Being able to use a dictionary. And many times teachers are so overwhelmed, and they may not even know what to do. They may not even know how to read what's called the ILAP in the state. Or in other states, it's called something different, ILP. They may not know how to read those or what to do. And so many times teachers will just pass them on, and the administration will pass them on, even if that child has not done much work, because the ILAP has not been followed, and so legally you can't fail a child just because of language. And if you don't follow that child's language plan, then that child cannot be failed. So we've got these kids out here who do very little work, and they don't fail, they just are passed on. So that child may actually graduate and not have many skills. And I'm going to talk about that in a future video. There's a very high profile case of a child in Connecticut who both had a disability and was an English learner. She's actually suing her school. And that's not going to be the next video. That's probably going to be 2 or 3 videos. So stay tuned for that. So there's all these problems going on with English learners. And honestly, it just hasn't been made a priority. And there started to be some improvement, particularly in the South, in the last probably 15 years. Because there's been more and more students arriving in the South who are English learners, and there's become a need to address this, particularly in what you might call the New South, the big cities like Nashville or Atlanta or Memphis. There's been some attention to this. However, unfortunately, that attention is going away. The Office of English Language Acquisition, or the OLELA, was the group within the Department of Education that administered funds to schools for Title III for English learners. It also protected students' civil rights. So if there was a problem, a parent or a student or a concerned community member could file a complaint, and this office or investigators with this office, part of the Office of Civil Rights, which is works with other groups too, but there were special investigators just within this office, would investigate that. And so that's huge. And then also provided things like training. They had a huge conference every year for teachers. All of that's gone. It was one of the first offices to go in the Department of Education after Trump took office. And there's a lot of questions right now about how English learner services will look in the future, because there's not a plan for that money. No one really knows what's going to happen with Title III, if there's going to be that money. I have heard from other teachers kind of on the grapevine, education groups, that money's being limited, or that school is not getting that money in the fall and they're planning for that. More scary to me are the new policies, the new anti-DII policies, anti-diversion, equity, and inclusion policies. Those are incredibly broad, and I'm going to talk about that again in another video, but they're really broad. And in some schools, in some states, that may lead to this accusation that English learner services is something that is discrimination, that it is something that's special, that's not given to all students of all ethnicities. And that's not true, because admission into the program is based on language. It's not based on ethnicity. It's based on language. That would be like saying that, a student with disability gets extra status, which most people in this country wouldn't say that. They would say that we don't have enough funding and enough needs for those students, and I would agree. So it's just a time where we really don't know what's going on. Again, through message boards, through these Facebook groups I'm in, I'm hearing rumors like, well, our superintendent said that probably in 2 years we won't have English learner programs, or we're going to have to restructure the program to make it more pushing, which is where the teacher comes into the classroom, because of funding. I've heard things like, because of the new anti-DEI law, we've been told that we can't offer interpreters for parents, which is amazing. And there's a lot of legislation, particularly Every Student Succeeds at ESSA, which replaced No Child Left Behind, that insists that parents need to be aware of what's going on with their child. So there's just a lot of unknowns right now. about what's going to happen in the future. This is something that needs more attention, not less, and so it really concerns me when I hear these things about what's going on. So, thank you for watching. If you are interested in education policy, again, please like and subscribe. And also, if you have questions, comments, if they're polite, if they're civil, please put those below in the description box. And thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. Until next time, keep learning.